introduction, but sometimes it happens to be true. And that's the case tonight. I think it's given to a few men in every generation to exert a great influence on their times. And I think our speaker tonight very definitely belongs in this category. It would be entirely improper here to, in a brief introduction, to try to evaluate his massive contributions to the literature of American history, but let me point out that I have marveled at how effectively he has operated on many levels. On the professorial level, occupying chairs in a great many of the best institutions in this country and abroad, and then on the level of scholarly publication. How many of us have been introduced to American history on the college level through the growth of the American Republic? And then, of course, his writing hasn't been all purely of the scholarly kind. Every once in a while we pick up the New York Times magazine and find a stimulating article by him. And then, too, he has been on the lecture circuit. It's with a great deal of pleasure, then, and pride that I introduce Dr. Henry Steele Commager, who will speak to us on the topic American Nationalism. Dr. Commager.
Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen of the Augsburg community, it gives me very great pleasure to be here at an institution which has connections, though somewhat remote, with my own family background, and connections not so remote with Scandinavia and my long-standing interest in that part of the globe and in Lutheranism. When the various authorities of the three colleges were trying to work out some arrangements of 3 lectures, I threw in the sponge, I think, on any attempt to get genuine coherence, that is, a genuine series of lectures, and concluded that they better let me talk about independent subjects at each of the colleges. I spoke of some aspects of the Civil War at Hamline College this morning, spoke on the question why the South lost the war, and I want to speak to you this evening, on the really preliminary subject, the one which should have come first, of the nature of American nationalism, which is really an inquiry into the question why the United States is a nation, how it happened to be a nation, how it happened to hold together. Historians, as well as the rest of us, tend to accept the doctrine of inevitability altogether too easily. We are all, as has been said, camp followers of victorious armies, and we're all camp followers of events that have taken place, and all too rarely do we inquire why they took place or consider the alternatives to the past. We take for granted the existence of a single nation. We take for granted that the United States should have survived and should have grown, and that the principle of unity should have survived in this part of the globe, which we should not, of course, take for granted. We have no reason to do so. We should ask ourselves, I think, every time we address ourselves to a problem of this nature, why it was we didn't go the way of South America. What was it that turned Latin America into 20 states, but this part of North America into 1 state? Why didn't we fragment the way that very large area of the world, which had to start with more elements of unity and more elements of cohesion in religion and in language and in common background than the territory now occupied by the United States has? How it happened, it fragmented into 20-some countries, whereas the United States grew into a single country. I could address myself then to this basic question of the origins and the nature of American nationalism, the distinction between the American experience and the experience of most of the countries, I was about to say of the Western world, I think we can now say of the whole globe, for the principle of fragmentation now obtains throughout most of Africa and now obtains in large parts of Asia as well. There had, of course, been nations long before the American and the French Revolution, but the rise of self-conscious nationalism, of cultural and linguistic and emotional and psychological nationalism, is largely a product of the last century and a half or century and three-quarters, largely a product of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Into the vexed question of the ultimate origins of nationalism, I do not propose to enter tonight. As you know, there are some who trace nationalism back even to the Greek city-states, and others to medieval origins. But even those most insistent on the older beginnings of nationalism readily concede that the nationalism of the second half of the 18th and the 19th century represented something quite new in history, and that almost everything we now think of as nationalism was a product of this relatively modern period. Beginning with the French Revolution, older nations like France herself, for example, or like the Norway of Wergeland or the Denmark of Grundtvig, experienced a new birth of nationalism. And all through the 19th century and into the 20th, nations struggled toward birth as states, and states disintegrated into nations, as people conscious of a common culture and a common language and very often a common religion tried to transform this cultural unity into political unity, or tried to give older and artificial political organizations a new and more meaningful character. Thus, with countries like Greece and Serbia in the early years of the century, and the many states of Latin America, for example, or with Belgium and Germany, Italy, Romania, Bohemia, Finland in later years. And thus, in the 20th century, the pattern is not only repeating itself, it is increasing, it is being enhanced with the nations of Africa and of Asia. The culmination of this, in the eyes of some scholars, a lamentable culmination, was the principle of self-determination written into the European settlement after 1918, 1919, and the climacteric has been that extraordinary wave of nationalism which has brought something like 40 to 50 new nations into existence since 1945. We are, in fact, living in the greatest era of the history of nationalism. I think it is the era that goes before a decline, but that is another matter. Against this background of emergent or renascent nationalisms, the American experience appears to be a familiar one, and historians have customarily fitted American nationalism into this general picture of modern nationalism so familiar in European history. To some extent, that is correct enough, for many of the same forces that animated nationalism abroad stimulated and animated nationalism in the New World as well. Romanticism, democracy, reform, and so forth. And many of the important elements of the economy that have made for unification operated, of course, in the Western world as well. Nevertheless, in a very real sense, the American experience differs fundamentally from the European experience. It can be said that the American experience, far from being an extension of Old World nationalism, was in a sense a reversal of it. and that the student of history is called upon to explain the nature of that reversal. This was the view of one of the most sagacious of all the founders of our nation. I refer to John Adams, who in a famous letter to his friend Hezekiah Niles of Niles Register, later in his life, looked back over the Revolution and mused about its meaning. The colonies, he said, had grown up under constitutions of government so different. There was so great a variety of religions. They were composed of so many different nations. The customs, manners, and habits had so little resemblance. Their intercourse had been so rare. Their knowledge of each other was so imperfect, that to unite them in the same principles and theory and the same system of action was a very difficult enterprise. The complete accomplishment of it in so short a time and by such simple means was a singular example in the history of mankind. 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before effected. It's quite true. No artist had ever before effected it. It was something new in the world. Because 13 American states hugging the Atlantic seaboard became a single nation spanning the whole continent, embracing eventually 48 states, and did this with fantastic rapidity, we take American nationalism for granted. But I submit to you there was nothing foreordained about it. And we must ask why American nation didn't go the way, the American continent didn't go the way of the European continent, the Latin American, and the African and Asian in our own time. The most elementary foundations of the new nation still remain to be laid, and many contemporaries thought that the forces that threatened the new nation were far more formidable than the forces that promised it prosperity. The evidence here is overwhelming. I need not elaborate upon it at this time. But even friends of the American nation, like Turgot, for example, said that the forces of disintegration were much stronger than those of integration. In the general union of the provinces among themselves, he wrote to his friend Dr. Price, I do not see a coalition or a fusion making a body one and homogeneous. It's only an aggregation of parts, always too much separated, preserving always a tendency to division by the diversity of its laws, manners, opinions, and the inequality of actual forces. There's a copy of the Dutch Republic. And again this note was sounded, the note that this new nation couldn't possibly stay together. Widespread belief that a republic had to be small. This was drawn from Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. One of the reasons Jefferson couldn't stand Montesquieu was he couldn't get over this observation, which was so widely accepted. Remember the theory that a republic could be small, and if you have a large country, only a military despotism could possibly hold it together. Therefore, the prospects for a country like the United States trying to be a single nation were very bleak indeed. It is interesting to recall that even as late as the 1830s, the most perspicacious of all the observers of the American scene, I refer to Alexis de Tocqueville, in that Magisterial Democracy in America, added a famous chapter on the future prospects of the Union and said they were bad. The Union would not and could not survive. Whatever faith I may have in the perfectibility of man, until human nature is altered and men wholly transformed, I shall refuse to believe in the duration of a government which is called upon to hold together 40 different peoples disseminated over a territory equal to one half of Europe, to avoid all rivalry, ambition, and struggle between them, and to direct their independent activity to the contemplation of the same designs. Well, notwithstanding these bleak predictions, which were more than an expression of hostility, predictions which came from the friends of the American Union and continued to come from the friends of the American Union well into the new century, the forces of nationalism did in the end prove more powerful than the forces of particularism. Yet it was touch and go that they would do so, and we must never underestimate the forces of particularism, nor must we forget. This is really the point of when I was speaking of this morning. Nor must we forget that in a sense Tocqueville was justified. The nation did break in two. We tend to overlook that elementary fact of our history because Appomattox reversed the decision of Fort Sumter. Nevertheless, the nation did break in two. The fragmentation which they predicted did come. And had the South been victorious, as it well might have been, and as by all the circumstances of the case one expected it to be in 1861, because the South held most of the trump cards, had the South been victorious, that process of fragmentation underway would probably have spread throughout the Union and fragmented what is now the United States into a number of independent states. It is almost impossible to exaggerate some of the forces of localism and particularism that did obtain in the United States of the early years of the century, the rivalries, the jealousies, the mistrust and misgivings that obtained from state to state in the Revolutionary years and the post-Revolutionary years. Loyalty tended to be, as we might well expect, to the state rather than to as new a thing as the nation. And we see in our own day how difficult it is to create national or let us say supranational loyalty. We have only to imagine the difficulty of creating an all-European loyalty if the common market should develop into something more than a common market, should develop into a political union in Europe as well. How long would it take for the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Belgians, and the Dutch to transfer their loyalty from their own country to the new political organization that was created, for that matter? How long has it taken the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh to transfer their loyalty to the new Britain, which was created in the course of the 18th and the 19th century? Here, for example, is Lewis Morris of New York, one of the famous Morris family, who provided in his will that his son Gouverneur, who later gave the final literary draft to the Constitution of the United States, provided the Gouverneur should never set foot in the neighboring colony of Connecticut, lest he imbibe that low cunning so incident to the people of that country. Over half a century later, James Fenimore Cooper put it in the mouth of the aristocratic Mrs. Littlepage in that famous series of Littlepage novels. The observation, "I should have sent Evans to Yale had it not been for the miserable matter of speaking they have in New England. I have no wish to have a son of mine who might pass for a Cornishman." Well, it's easy to exaggerate these expressions of mutual distrust. They could probably be matched today from one part of the country to another. Perhaps more important were those beginnings of intercolonial cooperation, of intercolonial unity that trace back even in the 1740s and 50s, like the American Philosophical Society, or the common experience of intercolonial wars, or that happy practice, that happy habit of study in out-of-colony and out-of-state colleges, which let us hope will persist and flourish in the United States. One of the most lamentable developments, I may say parenthetically, in recent higher education, state education in this country is a habit of penalizing out-of-state students in one way or another. There is no more certain way of making an institution parochial, of losing that quality of cosmopolitanism which it must have if out-of-state and out-of-nation students are discouraged. Every institution must draw on the whole of the United States, and on the whole, for that matter, on the whole of the globe if it can. Well, those forces underway, educational and philosophical, intellectual as well as practical, that enabled Patrick Henry to say the distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New England are no more, that enabled Tom Paine to write that our citizenship in the United States is our national character. Citizenship in any particular state is our local distinction, but by the latter we're known at home, but by the former we're known throughout the world. Our great title is American. Well, I say it might have gone either way. We take for granted that it would go the way of a single nation, but we should not do so. We should ask how it happened that people with the most diverse of racial stocks of any modern people, with the most varied soils and climates, with the most diverse and competing economic interests, with the most variegated and potentially the most clashing religious patterns, nevertheless achieved a national character. and achieved it with an ease that confounded the expectations of history and of experience. In the old world, with its age-long traditions of feudalism and of dynastic nationalism, the principle of particularism triumphed over the principle of unity and of the general, as it triumphs in Africa and Asia and the Middle East today. But in the New World, or at least in the American part of it, the principle of the general triumphed over the particular. The Old World territory was fragmented, and cultures and languages and religions followed conflicting paths. In the New World, the fragmentation, which was clearly underway in the 17th and 18th century, as there was a Spanish America and a French America and an English America, and there might have, to the south, a Portuguese America, and there might have been a Swedish America. This fragmentation was arrested, and then it was reversed and succeeded by the principle of concentration. Now, one of the important considerations here is that the United States developed almost entirely in the era of industrialism, the era of the Industrial Revolution, and that in some degree unification was a product of that Industrial Revolution. That is important, but it's not quite as important as one might suppose. After all, Latin America too developed in the era of the Industrial Revolution without consequent unification. Even the tremendous force of 20th century economy and technology have not so far been powerful enough to induce little states of Central America, for example, to unite. Even the United Fruit Company hasn't been able to do that. In Europe, too, the Industrial Revolution appears to have accentuated rather than to have mitigated the rise of modern nationalism. Scotland, for example, adhered to England before the rise of industry, but the most pressing economic considerations have not yet induced Norway and Sweden to reunite. On the contrary, they broke apart in the period of the height of the Industrial Revolution, and haven't induced Norway, Sweden, and Denmark to reunite, even for the control of Skåne, which is really Danish, though the Swedes claim it. Finland was once part of Sweden. Scandinavia was closer to unification in the reign of Frederick II, than it is today. It is not clear that industrialism is unifying Asia or Africa at the present time, though possibly if China really triumphs and consolidates itself, it may do so. Well, what then is the explanation of this phenomenon? This phenomenon is so remarkable that in the past men tended to explain it on the basis of providential intervention. Here again, the evidence is all overwhelming, but that the whole revolutionary generation found what may have been an accurate explanation, but was a deceptively easy explanation, namely that Providence intervened. It was really heaven that created a single unit in America rather than the forces of history itself. However valid that explanation may be for theologians, it doesn't appeal very strongly to historians who are not as certain their ability to read the purposes of heaven in the pages of history. In a very real sense, President Lincoln's famous description of the event was a correct historical description. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. American nationalism was a creative act. It was a product of intelligence. It was a product of will, product of the deliberate application of these things, of will and intelligence, by statesmen and scholars and soldiers and men of letters and scientists and artists and explorers, by all sorts of people. Where in most of the countries of the old world, the social and cultural and the emotional foundations of nationalism were laid long before the political structure was created. In the United States, the political structure came first, and the task of vindicating the political decision made at three times, 1776, 1783, and 1787, that task remained for subsequent generations. It was vindicated in many areas, on the field of battle, in the arena of the economy, of society, of culture, and of emotion. When the long traditions of English or Danish or Swedish, French nationalism long traditions of a common language, a law, religion, history, are kept in mind, and when they're compared with what the United States had in the 1770s or 80s, this contrast of the two types of nationalism is clear enough. Even in those countries where political nationalism was very old, as it was, for example, in England or France, the nation grew out of well-cultivated soil. It grew out of a century-long process of cultural integration. In short, the nations of the old world were products of history. Similarly, with many of the new nations of the 19th and the 20th century, Norway, for example, didn't become a nation in 1900. Norway had been in the process of becoming a nation for over 1,000 years. It didn't have to create the institutions and the elements of nationalism when it broke away from Sweden in 1905. Belgium, Serbia, Italy, Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all of these countries, these new nations of the post-1919 period, weren't without national backgrounds. Poland had a 1,000-year history. Bohemia had a 1,000-year history. Italy had more than a 2,000-year history behind it. Germany had at least 1,000 years of history. Cultural nationalism and emotional and psychological nationalism, before they achieved the crystallization of this in political institutions. The United States started off without that long background of nationalism and started off with the political institutions, the constitutional institutions. They then had to set about to create the nation, and that is to what Mr. Lincoln, in a sense, was referring to. They had to furnish this new nation with the common body of laws, with a language, a literature, education, history, heroes and villains, with myths and traditions, with all of those things, tangible and intangible, that contribute to the sense of unity and the sense of nationalism. As Thomas Paine said, and Paine himself contributed a great deal to it, a new era for politics has struck, a new method of thinking hath arisen. Men had to reshape their minds and address themselves to the task of nationalism. It was indeed a new era. It required new thinking. That's what Noah Webster, the young man of dictionary fame, meant when he pointed out that America is an independent empire and ought to assume a national character. Nothing, he said, could be more ridiculous than the servile imitation of the manners, the languages, and the vices of foreigners. And it's a very interesting trinity there, one that was to linger in the American imagination from that time on to almost our own time. I think only in the experience of the younger people here has this notion of New World innocence and Old World depravity, Old World corruption finally disappeared until the 1920s or 30s, maybe into the 40s. It was an article of faith of Americans generally that the Old World spelt corruption, depravity, and vice, and the New World spelt innocence and virtue. In 1788, Webster exhorted his fellow countrymen, unshackle your minds, act like independent beings. You have an empire to raise and support by your exertions. You have a national character to establish and extend by your wisdom and your virtue. So with one of the founding fathers after another, and I shall not belabor you with quotations from this time, Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, who agreed on so few things, we're in entire agreement on this. As Hamilton said, we are striving more and more in this country to be national and free from all foreign ingredients, so that we shall be neither Greeks nor Trojans, but truly Americans. This notion of being truly Americans was very widespread in that generation. It was a very self-conscious notion, a very deliberate notion, and it was to be found in the most unlikely of places. Thus, for example, the mathematician Nicholas Pike, who produced a very famous and widely used arithmetic back in 1788, just the crucial date when the new nation was coming into being. He wrote in his preface, as the United States are now an independent nation, it was judged that a system might be calculated more suitable to our meridian than those heretofore published. That wasn't actually as absurd as one might suppose. Jefferson's adoption of the decimal system does more than anything else, I think, to explain American economic supremacy over Britain. And if you ever try to do your sums in pounds, shillings, and pence or calculate your weight in stone, you'll readily come to that conclusion yourself. It was time for a new arithmetic, but that isn't precisely what Nicholas Pike meant. He meant we should get rid of the old mathematics and get a new mathematics because we were a new nation. Even geography had a nationalist slant. One Robert Davidson, otherwise unjustly unknown to fame, wrote a geography in verse, 12 cantos of it altogether as he went from continent to continent. And he finally came over here. We'll now take our stand, he said, on this happy, prolific, and wide-spreading land, where nature hath wrought with a far nobler hand. No more let the old world be proud of her mountains, her rivers, her mines, her lakes, and her fountains. Though great in themselves, they no longer appear to be great when compared with the great we have here. This notion that even nature made for American superiority was a widely held notion, and has continued to be, not merely in the gross form of pointing out that Niagara Falls is bigger than anything Europe has, and the Mississippi River is wider than anything Europe has, but in somewhat more subtle fashion. John Adams, for example, when he was our first minister to England, noted again and again the superiority of American nature to English nature. It will be long, I hope, before ridings, parks, and pleasure grounds and gardens grow so much in fashion in America. Nature has done far greater things for us, furnished noble materials there. The oceans, islands, rivers, mountains, valleys are all laid out on a grander scale. And his wife, who was equally forthright, pointed out that even the birds didn't sing very well in England. Only in America did the birds really sing very well. Nature bursting into life with a sudden vegetation yields a delicious fragrance and verdure in the New World, which exhilarates the spirits and excites the imagination. Even our storms and tempests, our thunder and lightning are horribly grand. Nothing here appears to leave the bounds of mediocrity. Nothing is ferocious except man, which was a very characteristic addition as well, part of this general thesis of the depravity of the old world. Well, however it might fare with geography and mathematics and even with the birds, one thing that was clear was that the new nation had to have its own philosophy. As Joel Barlow put it, he was one of that Hartford Wit group, remember, with Freneau and Dwight and others. Here so shall man a newer birth shall find, and a new range of reason lift his mind, feed his strong intellect with purer light, and nobler sense of duty and of right. And here we have one of the persistent themes of American poetry and indeed of American literature, which we can follow from Freneau's Rising Glory of America right through Whitman's ecstatic beautiful world of new superber birth that rises to my eyes like a limitless golden cloud filling the western sky. You will remember it from his later poems. Again and again he struck the same note in By Blue Ontario Shores, and thou nation with thy equal brood, thou mother with thy equal brood, and so many of the others. It's a persistent theme in American prose as well. From Tom Paine's reply to the Abbe Raynal, our style and manner of thinking, he says, have undergone a revolution more extraordinary than the political revolution in the country. We see with other eyes, we hear with other ears, we think with other thoughts than those we formerly used. We can look back on our own prejudices as if they'd been the prejudices of other people. And that is echoed 70 or 80 years later with Lincoln's touching admonition that this nation was the last best hope of earth. Well, how then did Americans go about achieving this new sense of nationalism, and how did they preserve it? How did they expand it up to the great test of the 1860s? That test had come in the 40s or 50s. The event might have gone the other way. Well, I can do no more than suggest some of the broader aspects of this extraordinary enterprise. It's clear that national unity for the vast area now embraced in the continental United States was not foreordained. Americans lacked in the beginning many of the ingredients that are supposed to be essential for nationalism. This is no occasion to canvass those ingredients. Suffice it to say that though scholars are not unanimous about them, they're agreed that you need a political framework, a united people who want to belong to a nation, a common language, a common territory, a common body of tradition and of history, and a common religious faith. No one of these is quintessential, but most of them are desirable or necessary. Now, the United States, to its good fortune, did have some of these elements. It had a people who, at least after they got rid of the people who didn't want it, did want to be a single nation. We tend to forget so many things that are unpleasant, just as psychologists tell us. We tend to forget events in our own lives that are unpleasant, and we tend to forget that we drove out about 80,000 loyalists during the Revolution out of a population of about 3 million whites. That's a pretty substantial number to be driven out of the country, and compares rather well with some of the recent exoduses of 20th century, mid-20th century Europe. After we got rid of the loyalists who didn't want the revolution and didn't want an independent nation, those who were left undoubtedly did. So there was a great deal of unity there. We had certain other ingredients. We had a common language and a common tradition of law and of government. What the new nation lacked were some of the very important ingredients. It lacked as yet a political organization. That had to be created. It lacked a sound territorial base. That was a very dangerous situation. It lacked the history and the traditions customarily associated with successful nationalism, and it lacked some of the institutions you might think of as perhaps superficial, but that have been very important historically. It lacked a king, it lacked a ruling class, it lacked an established church, an army, a navy. It lacked a military and national antipathies. It lacked the capital city. It's still in process of making a capital city. I think we finally made one after 150 years or so. And as Henry James once observed, it lacked even a national name. We don't quite know what to call ourselves. We call ourselves Americans, which is rather rough on the Mexicans and the Canadians and the others who don't like it at all. We can't. We should probably call ourselves Colombians, as some urged at the beginning, but it's never caught on. Well, then look at this process of the creation of a nation, and look at it through the eyes of 1776 or 1787, if you will, when almost everything remained to be done, rather than through the eyes of 1962, when almost everything has been done. Look at some of these major ingredients which the new nation did possess: a common people, a common language, legal and political traditions. And now we take these all almost entirely for granted. For example, we take a common people for granted. Yet in the light of the prodigious movements of population in World War I and II, we should not take it for granted. What terrorism the Germans have resorted to in order to obtain a unified people. What wholesale murders and transplantings, and fantastic movements of population since the war. 12 million Germans moved from Eastern Germany to the West. Millions of Poles and Russians shifted about. Millions of Czechs and Slovaks and Austro-Germans and Italians. 3 million Hindus and Muslims moved back and forth across boundary lines. Nor is this merely a phenomenon of the 20th century. Recall the efforts of the Germans and the French and the Danes and the Finns and the Czechs and the Italians and the Turks and the Greeks all through the 19th century to achieve a homogeneous people, to extend their dominion over all of their own nationals, and to force all who were not nationals into a nationalistic pattern, to force them all to speak German, or all to speak French, or all to speak Italian. We did that, as I say, with some 80,000 loyalists, but since then we've never done it. The American people of the 1780s was in fact a heterogeneous people, as Crèvecoeur observed in one of the most familiar of all his letters. It made its people Americans overnight. This habit of peaceful transformation of the German and the Scot and the Irishman and the Jew into American persisted all through the 19th and into the 20th century. And what is interesting here is the numerous counter-movements, like the Know-Nothingism of the 40s and the 50s, and the Nativism, and the Ku Kluxism of modern times, never made any dent on this process. Notwithstanding an immigration that eventually came to some 40 millions of people, and accepting the Negro, who were a special problem because they'd been slaves, the United States has never had any unassimilable block of foreigners. It's never had any group who've rejected the United States or who've been rejected by the United States, unless the Negroes in the South do constitute such a group. In the perspective of history, I think it's not wholly unfair to say that a common people is as much an achievement of American history as it was itself a fact of American history. In fact, Americans created in this world a new homogeneity, and they are still in process of creating a kind of homogeneity that is probably not known in other nations with comparable heterogeneous elements in the population. So too with the common language. It is, of course, a language of the mother country, and it still is. The notion that American English differs from English is an illusion. It's fundamentally the same, and any American can be understood in England, which is more than any Englishman can be in England. The Yorkshireman can't understand the Devonshireman, and the Cockneys can't be understood in Oxford. Though there were certain protests against the English inheritance, these were for the most part eccentric or fanciful. Yet even at the time of independence, the common language was in part a deliberate achievement, not just a fact of nature. Substantial numbers of Americans in the 1770s were of non-British stock. They were Germans and Dutch and Swiss and French and Swedes. And there were schools and newspapers and other pressures making for the perpetuation of these foreign elements. Yet even in the 18th century, these elements of foreignness proved wholly ineffective. And nothing is more interesting than the rapidity with which the pressures of American uniformity swept away and have continued to sweep away almost all the traditions and heritages of the non-English. We did start off with a very good common language, but other countries too have a common language, but colonies of foreigners in the Argentine, in Brazil, in Chile. The Italians have preserved their language and culture. The Germans have preserved their language and culture. The English, going out around the world, took their language with them and kept it. The American colonies in Paris, in Rome, in Copenhagen, and Stockholm remain American. Americans don't become naturalized as soon as they go to Germany or France, or they don't abandon their language and forget it in one generation, as we take for granted Norwegians and Swedes abandon their language and forget it in one generation. So men born in Norway tell you they can no longer speak Norwegian after being here 20 years. Wouldn't you be surprised to go to Paris and find Americans saying they could no longer speak English after 20 years in France? Well, third, there was a tradition of law and governmental practices which we inherited. The law was a common law in effect in all the colonies. All Americans made contracts in the same way and regulated their roads and ferries in the same way and interpreted their marriage obligations in the same way and so forth. There were, of course, modifications, but the modifications were of minor importance. Basically, there was this great common denominator which Americans not only took over, but in a sense improved upon and spread in our state system as well as in our national system. And the reaction against the common law never got anywhere. The pressure for Roman law never got anywhere. The common law was so deeply implanted in the whole of America that it triumphed over all its rivals and over all modifications. And so too with much of the political and administrative practices that were inherited largely from Britain, to a lesser extent from other parts of the old world. Nothing is more impressive than the rapidity with which Americans at the outset of their history managed to create the political institutions and the administrative mechanisms of nationalism. Nothing is more impressive than the fact that there was very little trial and error called for. The United States moved into nationalism on the political and constitutional front with an ease that staggers us as we look back upon it. Everyone understood everyone else. They spoke the same language. They had the same political ideas. a Washington of Virginia and a Jefferson of Virginia, a John Adams in Massachusetts, a Pinckney in South Carolina, a John Jay in New York, thought the same way about politics and agreed in every important essential about constitutional institutions. Well, so much for the institutions we did have that made for nationalism. Now, how about the ones we didn't have that made for nationalism? I said there were a number of them. We didn't have a common religion. How did we turn religious diversity into an element of strength? Normally, religious diversity was supposed to be an element of weakness, and all of you are familiar with the dread story of European nations imposing religious uniformity upon their people, the endless and tragic tale of persecution, of the auto da fe and the Inquisition and burning at the stake and harassment, the expulsion of the Huguenots and the harassment and the destruction of the Catholics in Ireland and so forth. This is one of the most tragic tales in history, and all for the purpose of getting religious uniformity. The notion that you could have religious diversity in one and the same state was a notion intolerable to the European official mind. And as Europeans looked upon the new experiment in America and saw that not only was there no state church, but there was no uniformity in religion, they commonly predicted failure for the experiment. How did we turn religious diversity into an element of strength rather than of weakness? We have only to contemplate the consequences. Had there been any effort to establish a single religious pattern over the whole of the United States, to realize how terribly important that early decision was. It was a decision brought about by circumstance, to be sure. Nevertheless, it was a wise and far-sighted decision, and it was made almost automatically, almost instinctively by the Founding Fathers, and has been largely adhered to. We are, I suppose, the only major country of the Western world that has never had a religious war. We are the only major country that has never had any major religious persecutions. The fact that we have minor religious persecutions from time to time merely lights up the absence of major persecutions in the realm of religion, and lights up to the unique good fortune of the United States in this realm, and the extraordinary wisdom of the Founding Fathers in avoiding the kind of conflicts that would inevitably have torn the nation apart had we allowed ourselves to be involved in them. So too with other elements of nationalism. How did we make territory an element of strength rather than of weakness? I reminded you a few moments ago that in the eyes of most Europeans, of most students of the 18th century, a republic had to be small. It couldn't be large. The only republics known in history, the republics of the ancient Greece, or the early Republic of Rome, or possibly the Swiss cantons. Great nations had to be large. Large nations had to be military despotisms, otherwise they'd fall apart. We were born the largest nation in the Western world. We sometimes overlook that elementary fact. Russia was perhaps larger, if Russia was indeed a nation. But east-westward from the boundaries of Russia, the new United States was the largest territory of any nation of the Western world, stretching all the way out to the Mississippi River. A perfectly staggering territory. How would you hold it together? How did we make a territory an element of strength instead of an element of disintegration? We take this territorial unity for granted, but as I've said so often, we need not do so. We should not do so. No one else has been able to do so. The great historian Henry Adams, surveying the United States in 1800, wrote a famous paragraph as he took his position in 1800 and looked at America through the eyes of that time. No prudent person, he said, dared to act on the certainty that when settled, government could comprehend the whole of the nation. And when the day of separation should arrive, and America should have her Prussia, Austria, and Italy, as she already had her England, France, and Spain, what else could follow but a return to the old conditions of local jealousies, wars, and corruptions, which had made a slaughterhouse of Europe? Yet the result was otherwise. Territorial growth more rapid and more extensive than that of any other nation, with the exception of 20th century Russia, did not in fact make for disunity, but strengthened unity. The West was, if anything, the most unifying part of America instead of the disunifying part. Instead of fragmenting the nation, What happened was that westward movement diffused nationalism. Instead of contributing to particularism, it encouraged the more general spread of patriotism and of loyalty. We even take for granted, as we should not, the rapidity of that westward movement. How extraordinary it is, after all, when we reflect that young John Quincy Adams, who was one of the most precocious young men in all of our history, was at the age of, I think, 14 or so with his father in Paris when his father John signed the Treaty of Paris, creating the new United States. And that old John Quincy Adams was still in Congress when the United States acquired Oregon and California. In the lifetime of a single man who was a statesman, this nation had come into being and spread westward to the Pacific coast. Nothing like that ever happened before in all history. It took Rome centuries for a comparable expansion, and so too with other nations. How did we make this extraordinarily rapid expansion an element of strength? How do we diffuse nationalism? Well, we have in fact diffused nationalism, and American patriotism is to an extraordinary degree a generalized and nationalized affair. Very few Americans have that passionate attachment, for example, to the soil that is so common in most European countries, so common in England or in France or in Denmark, for example. It's the whole of the United States, you know, from sea to shining sea, that we have our admiration for, rather than the single community or the single valley or the single river. And that's always been the case. We have no literature comparable to the Scandinavian or the English literature that cherishes the locality. You know, the 2-volume work on fly casting in the upper test, or the 2-volume study on cricket in lower puddle or upper puddle, or whatever it happens to be. The famous blue books of German literature, hundreds and hundreds of them celebrating church towers, or celebrating bridges, or celebrating stone walls, or something of that kind. This enormous local literature is almost wholly absent in the United States, as local patriotism is almost wholly absent in the United States. Boys and girls out in Texas sing, "We love thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills," just as though they'd really recognize a rill or a templed hill if they saw one, and take for granted that New England belongs to them just as the prairies belong to them. We have so much country. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote to Longfellow in the 1830s, "We really have no country at all." Well, there's some exaggeration there. But one foreign observer after another have noted this curious attachment to the whole nation rather than the particular part of it. This was partly a product of the pioneering experience, a habit of using up land and moving west, the delight in the open road and in wandering with the wind. It was in part a product of large-scale immigration, to break once and for all with the ancient soil of Ireland or of Norway, the uprooting which was not altogether a transplanting. The pioneer learned to cherish whatever land he cultivated while he cultivated it, but he couldn't afford to be too sentimental about it. "Woodman, spare that tree, touch not a single bough, in youth it sheltered me, and I'll protect it now," the pioneer said as he burned the forest or girded the trees, moving westward. He hadn't time for local attachments, because he wouldn't stay in any one place long enough. And again and again, this devotion to the whole country comes out, partly because it was so hard to get attached to the particular parts of it. Let's say the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, or the stockyards of Chicago, or the coal mines of Scranton. But you could love the whole thing, as my grandfather wrote in a song not wholly unknown. Du store ria fria land med guld I bjergens favn, med frihets palmen på ditt strand och hjem för vär en ärlig man. Those of you who can understand that ought to. It was the whole great, rich, free country that you paid your devotion to, rather than the particular part of it you happen to believe in. Well, to belong to. What of the third, and in the opinion of many scholars, the most important of the ingredients? A common body of traditions, of loyalties, of affection. The historical past with its heroes and its villains, its alliances and its antipathies, its institutions and its culture. This notion, this matter of the tradition of the historical past is one of the most fascinating of all the chapters in the history of the achievement of American nationalism. It is a subject I shall lecture about tomorrow at McAllister, and I do not. The time does not permit even a summary of it here. But I do want to remind you of how interesting it is that the new nation started without a past, and how quickly it achieved a past. For the past is an achievement, just as government was an achievement, just as a national culture was an achievement. How does a country that hasn't got a past set about getting one? Presumably it had to have one. At least every European who's written about the history of nationalism starts off saying we have to have the most important single ingredient is a common body of memory, common traditions, common sorrows, common triumphs, common glory. You have to look back on the age-long past, and all of you know the importance of that for Norwegian history. All of you know what Wergeland did to revive the ancient traditions of Norway, what Bjørnson did. You know what Grundtvig did in Denmark when he wanted to raise Denmark up from destruction, from the elendighe which he wrote about, the bankrupt and destroyed nation. He turned to past history. He turned to the heroic ballads of the past. He turned to the history of the Middle Ages. He revived the songs. He gave to the Danes a sense of their glorious past and an inspiration for what might come in the future. And this was a commonplace. This was happening in Germany. It was happening in Italy. Everywhere you turn. If a sense of the past, of shared experience, of common misery and common glory and triumph, of heroes and heroines is essential to nationalism, how is the United States going to be a nation if it didn't have a common past? It didn't have any past. Well, there were a great number of things we could do here, and I can't dwell upon the various ways in which we found substitutes for past and then worked up a past. We took the past of all of Europe and said it belonged to us, and we created our own past with extraordinary rapidity, and we substituted the future for the past, which is the most interesting of the single achievements. Whereas the other countries look back on a past, we look forward to a glorious future, which is so much better than a common past. We made do with what we had, and what we had turned out to be rather better than we thought it was. That achievement came a little bit later, though. We sometimes don't realize or remember how much of the rediscovery of the colonial period was a mid-19th century achievement, not an 18th century achievement. Mrs. Hemans, Miss Felicia Hemans of all things, of England, who wrote about the stern and rock-bound coast. You know it had to be an English woman, or she wouldn't have called that sandy beach a stern and rock-bound coast. Plymouth Rock was the only rock on it. But this was the 1840s. It was the 1840s that they rediscovered Bradford's history. It was the 1840s, 40s and 50s that we have Hiawatha, we have Evangeline. The discovery of the Puritans and the Pilgrims was an 1840-50 discovery, not a 1780-90 discovery. Long before that, there had to be a recreation of the past, and by great good fortune, that was made possible by the deification of the Revolutionary Fathers. How extraordinary it is that we've telescoped history in America. We began that process of telescoping history very, very early in our history. Before Washington died, he belonged to the same historical genre as Frederick Barbarossa and Joan of Arc, as Robert the Bruce. He belonged to the ages, as it were. And when Lincoln died, Stanton said so appropriately, now he belongs to the ages, and he did right away. And we managed to cast an aura of romance and of tradition over our own contemporaries almost. And to this day, we do so. Little boys and girls growing up in America confuse Buffalo Bill with Robin Hood. It's all one as far as they're concerned. Buffalo Bill just got out of the way a few years ago, and the cowboys and the Indians are still hunting each other in the films. It's as recent as that. And men and women still alive can remember Well, they can remember Geronimo anyway. If they can't remember Custer's Last Stand, that's going back pretty far. But they can remember up to Geronimo of the 1890s. How amazingly recent this story is, this story of cowboys, the story of India. Yet it belongs to the same kind of past that Joan of Arc, belongs to the same kind of past as Robert the Bruce, or as Robin Hood, or as fill in your own, as Valdemar Sire in Danish history, for example, and the Dannebrog floating down from the heavens. And we've managed to, by a great achievement of the imagination or of the will, to extend our history backward, to give it a new dimension, as it were. Washington belonged to the ages while he was still alive. As early as 1776, John Adams could say he makes every European monarch look like a valet, which he did. And Parson Weems had his biography ready when he died, and was able to describe, as only a clergyman could, because only a clergyman had the inside track, just how he was received in heaven, just which of the angels came down to receive them with tears flowing down their faces, and what hallelujahs they raised, and all the rest of it. This achievement of a past within our own lifetime almost is one of the remarkable historical feats of the New World. And I know no other nation which has done that quite so well as the Americans have. We've been helped by the circumstances, for example, of Indian wars. I mentioned Geronimo and Custer's Last Stand to you. The Indians have been given us a kind of historical continuity and a link with the pre-pioneer days, a perpetual frontier war, much like the border wars of Scotland, for example, or the Crusades, and the Indian wars down to our own time have served much the same function in the American imagination as the Crusades served, or the border warfare served in the imagination of Europe. Well, there are various other elements of American nationalism. I see my time is pushing on, and I have very little time to develop them. Let me remind you of two or three of them, just in passing. Namely, that American nationalism was to an extraordinary degree the creation of the American people as a whole. You may take that for granted. We take most things for granted. Like the man who discovered suddenly he was been speaking prose all of his life. If you reflect on European nationalism, even on contemporary nationalism, the creation of Israel, the creation of the Arab states, the creation of Pakistan, the creation of Indonesia, you will recall that nations are to a very large degree the achievement not of the masses of the people, but of a monarchy, of a military, of an ecclesiastical institution, of the church, or of intellectual groups of one kind or another. Pakistan was invented by a Pakistani in Cambridge just a few years ago. Intellectuals or aristocrats or the military. In other respects, too, the absence of the military, for example, and the substitution of the voluntary association for the military, the absence of the established church, and the substitution of scores and hundreds of denominations for the religious element, the absence of the European type of romanticism, and the substitution of a romanticism which tended to look forward rather than to look backward, and therefore to associate itself with progressivism rather than with reaction. All of these were elements in the creation of the nation. We can see that what was created was not only the first modern nation, but a nation that had staying power. That in itself needs a great deal of explanation. The nation had staying power, and the institutions that organized it and accommodated it had staying power. Is it not impressive that in the past 180 years, nation after nation has come into being only to disintegrate into revolution, or to succumb to despotism, to fragment in war, to surrender to militarism? How very few of the nations created since 1789 have survived. Germany torn asunder, Italy given over to revolution after revolution and conquest after conquest, the states of Latin America swept by one revolution after another, Poland, Bohemia, the Baltic states destroyed. How few of the nations that survived have survived intact. How few of the new nations coming into being show much promise of that kind of survival, how few of them, indeed none of them, have the same constitution they had 150 years ago. How astonishing then, in the light of history, the survival of the United States. A survival, if the Southerners will forgive the term, a survival intact. How astonishing that we alone of the peoples who've come into existence since that time have the same Constitution we had at the beginning, the same Bill of Rights that we had at the beginning, the same federal system we had at the beginning, the same Republican government and the same democratic practices, the same rule of law, the same political parties even, the same two parties that emerged in Washington's administration are still contesting for your votes out here in Minnesota 170 years later. The same administrative institutions of the president, of the legislative body, of the courts and so forth that were set up in the 70s and 80s are still with us. How astonishing that the ingredients of nationalism, so deliberately combined in the generation of the Founding Fathers, proved harmonious for a 200-year period, and that we have, in so short a period of time, created an American nation and an American culture. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that splendid lecture, Dr. Commager. I think the applause indicated our appreciation. And thank you, too, for participating in the other events of the day, the coffee hour and the dinner. And I want to thank everyone, without singling anyone out, for their contributions to this event, to the McPherson Fund, to the Convocation Committee, and to everyone who had anything to do with getting this auditorium ready or working with the dinner. The convocation is dismissed. Adjourned, I should say.